And that works out to over 30 people a day being arrested and then investigated because people have complained about stuff they've said on social media that they think is offensive. And very few of those investigations result in prosecution, about 5%. But nevertheless, it obviously has a very chilling effect on free speech.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Free speech has always been a contested freedom. In 1943, in his Forgotten People broadcasts, Robert Menzies placed freedom of speech and expression second only to his famous reflections on the middle class. He reminded Australians that this was no instinctive right, but a hard-won principle that had to be painfully acquired. Freedom, Menzies warned, is not just for those we agree with, but also for those with whom we disagree. And he cautioned that without the untrammelled clash of opinion, today's truths would too easily become tomorrow's errors. 8 decades on, Menzies' insight feels as fresh as ever. Across the Anglosphere, governments reach for new misinformation laws, corporations punish employees for lawful speech, and online outrage mobs silence debate. In Australia, we've seen proposed anti-misinformation bills that would have handed regulators sweeping powers. In Britain, comedians and writers have been arrested simply for their words. In America, campus culture has drifted from debate towards suppression and now violence. The threats to open expression are multiplying. My guest today has stood at the very centre of this storm. Toby Young is the founder and General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, a conservative peer, a journalist and editor, and one of the most tireless defenders of liberty in the English-speaking world. After being cancelled from multiple public roles, Toby chose not to retreat but to organise, building a mass membership organisation that now fights thousands of cases each year to defend ordinary people punished just for saying what they believe. Menzies believed that free speech was the lifeblood of democracy and that power needs the cold douche of the critic to correct it. Toby Young has taken up that same conviction in our own time, standing against the censorious tides of government, corporations and cultural mobs. So in today's episode, we'll explore why free speech remains the most fundamental freedom of all and why without it, every other liberty is at risk. Toby, welcome to Afternoon Light.
Thank you.
Great to have you here in Melbourne. I guess I'd like to start our discussion today by a basic one. You've dedicated your career, and it's been a really wide-ranging and fascinating career, but fundamentally to free speech. How would you describe its importance to our democracy?
Well, that's a big question. I think Steven Pinker said there are 3 reasons to support free speech, but I can think of some more too. The first is the one that Robert Menzies focuses on in his radio broadcast in defence of freedom of speech and expression, which I think was the first one of the 4 freedoms he devoted a broadcast to. And that is that without free speech, we can find ourselves falling into error. It's the most reliable method of arriving at the truth, of avoiding error. And that applies both to politics and also to the advancement of human knowledge. And I think a good illustration of that point was what I think of as the error in the global response to the pandemic, the lockdowns. I was a big critic of the lockdown policy in the UK. And one of the reasons I think so many governments around the world, including here in Victoria, fell into that error is partly because people who had reservations about the wisdom of the lockdown policy, people who anticipated that the costs would likely outweigh the benefits, were afraid to speak out. It became heretical to challenge government's pandemic response. You were accused of being a granny killer, of not caring enough about particularly the most vulnerable people in our society who were at risk of becoming infected. And I think that's a really good illustration of how the absence of free speech, people feeling inhibited, not free to speak their minds about a particular policy, led to a really catastrophic error in public policy that was replicated around the world. The second reason that Steven Pinker gives is that free speech is a great way of holding power to account. That's why it's of such critical importance in liberal democracies. Unless we have freedom of the press, unless politicians are free to criticize their rivals, then inevitably democracy descends into some form of despotism, tyranny. And the third reason I think that Steven Pinker gives, if I recall, is that free speech is a great canary in the coal mine. It's a really useful barometer of how healthy democratic politics is. As soon as democratically elected leaders start clamping down on free speech, that is a big red flag. That's when your internal alarm should start going off. It's the canary in the coal mine in that respect. So a very useful way of measuring the health of a liberal democracy. But I can think of other reasons as well. Jordan Peterson has talked about how being able to speak freely, being able to say what we feel and be open in conversation with each other is an ineradicable part of our identity. It's part of what it is to be human. And I think you really feel that when someone does try and silence you or when you self-censor. It does feel like almost physical harm in the case of self-censorship, a kind of self-mutilation, shutting down a part of yourself. And you feel, another part of yourself bridling and pushing back. There's something kind of absolutely fundamental to our nature about being free to speak our mind, say what we think, not bite our tongues.
Well, I would agree, but it was interesting here in the state of Victoria during the pandemic, how easily people slipped into not being free and accepted it. Yes, we had people who spoke out and at some considerable risk about their concerns about the lockdown. And we had, you would have seen the terrible incident of a pregnant mother being arrested because she had posted on Facebook that she was trying to organise a protest against the lockdown in Ballarat, I think it was. And, she's being arrested, physically held down by the police because of a Facebook post. But in the main, the majority of people here accepted losing their freedoms. What was it about our nature? And I suspect it was a bit similar in the UK, although you didn't have such draconian lockdowns as we did here. But why did we seem so quick to give up our freedoms?
Yeah, I think it was. It was.
That was frightening.
It was. It was very disappointing. I remember being shocked at just how compliant the English population was when Boris Johnson, then our Prime Minister, first announced that we would have to stay at home, and how quick people were to dob in their neighbours for supposedly breaking the rules. Up until then, I think I'd laboured under the illusion that fascism could never take root in English soil, that we were a freedom-loving people and it would just never wash with us. And, that illusion was shattered when I saw, population fall into lockstep and willingly cooperate with the authorities to punish dissenters and heretics and rule breakers. And I guess looking at Australia from the UK, I sort of felt a similar sense of disillusionment. I thought of, Australians as being fierce defenders of their liberties, independent-minded, ordinary kind of larrikins. And yet, you were behaving like...
But as Clive James said, and I'm sure you've heard it many times before, we're not descended from convicts, but from the prison officers.
Yes,
so we're a law-abiding sort here in Australia.
That cannot possibly be the reason, because I remember I did check this on Wikipedia yesterday, and it said at one point, I think when the Australian population wasn't much more than about 16, 17 million, about 4 million Australians had a connection to someone who was transported from Ireland or the UK. So it can't be that the number of Australians descended
it's a
from
good line, though.
Prison officers outnumbers.
Toby, you talk about free speech being the canary in the coal mine, and when it's under threat, as it clearly is at the moment, that is an indication that our democracy is pretty sick. Why would you say that we seem to have fallen out of love with freedom? Is it because of the way we communicate through social media and 24/7 news cycles, and there's a kind of disconnect between ourselves that we didn't have 30 years ago, say, before we had the internet and social media? I find it hard to understand why people can be accepting of losing their freedom and can be accepting of complete intolerance of other views. We seem to have lost the ability to disagree well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's, without wanting to sound too partisan, I think it partly reflects the cultural triumph of the progressive left, when they still thought of themselves as part of the counterculture, as enemies of the establishment, as radicals and revolutionaries. Free speech was extremely important, and they stood up for, defended, fought for free speech. Now that they've obtained power, at least culturally, free speech has become less important to them. So free speech has lost its natural champions for decades, and the right haven't been as good. They're getting better at it, but not as good at standing up for free speech, articulating why it's important, as the liberal left were for decades. As you say, it partly reflects the rise of social media. So the conventional wisdom amongst liberal elites, amongst governing elites for decades was the counter-speech doctrine set out in a landmark First Amendment case in the first part of the 20th century, in which Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, said that the best remedy for misleading or false speech was not enforced silence, but more and better speech. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. That was the conventional wisdom for about 75 years. But I think the emergence of social media, the emergence of many more voices into the public conversation, led to the abandonment of the counter-speech doctrine and a kind of rediscovery of censorship. I think it also reflects the kind of brittleness of our governing elites, particularly across the English-speaking world. They've become lazy about defending the various public policies, their policy agenda, what unites them. And they've kind of fallen out of the habit of defending what it is they believe, what it is they want to do in the public square. And it's easier if someone disagrees with you, rather than engage in an argument and have to defend your position. It's easier to just accuse them of being misinformed or of being bad actors or of having been led astray by other bad actors. There's a kind of pretense on the part of our governing elites that their values transcend politics. You saw that during the pandemic, the idea that science dictated the policy response, and it was really beyond political dispute. So I think, our technocratic managerialist elites have fallen out of the habit of defending what it is they stand for, what they believe in, the policies they pursue, and they like to think of them as being above politics and therefore not in need of defence. And in part, that's a kind of tactical way of trying to narrow the Overton window. So people who challenge what it is they're trying to do feel outcast and demonized, and are therefore less likely to challenge it. But for a variety of reasons, as the various regimes across the English-speaking world have become more brittle and feel more besieged by the rise of insurgent populist parties, they've reached for the censorship button. That's become the kind of default response. It doesn't work. It's been largely ineffective. But nevertheless, that is the impulse they seem to be giving into. I think another thing to say about the decline in support for free speech, and it's a point that Menzies made in his famous radio broadcast, is that it's not natural to defend free speech. I mean, if you hear someone ridiculing things you hold most sacred, your impulse, the natural human impulse, is to want to destroy them, or at the very least kind of push them out, excommunicate them, cast them out. It takes an enormous effort to actually tolerate someone saying something you find deeply upsetting or offensive. And it's a habit that needs to be acquired and constantly cultivated. And as various institutions that have traditionally been tasked with cultivating that habit of listening well, of disagreeing without falling out, of tolerating dissent, institutions like newspapers and universities, they've sort of fallen down on the job. They haven't done a great job of upholding those values. And so the belief in free speech has begun to kind of atrophy and wither and is in great need of reinvigoration.
We have had a perennial issue in Australia over climate change and whether it's man-made or naturally occurring phenomenon, and now the sort of debate around net zero. And this is an issue that has brought down Prime Minister after Prime Minister after Prime Minister. It's sort of for the last 20 years been a very big challenge and debate. But it's interesting, a lot of the sort of, I guess, pro-climate change part of the scientific community and then political supporters as well, they really do try and shut down speech around this. The science is settled as if, it's in aspic, never to be touched again. And we're not debating that anymore. No more discussion, no more speech on this. I mean, these sorts of phenomena where, as you said, the Justice Brandeis theory where you allow more speech and more speech in the pursuit of truth.
Yes.
We see in Australia this quite, I think, a neat example of no, we need less speech because we've got to the truth and no room for discussion now.
Yeah. It's another good example, I think, of how progressive elites pretend that the policy agenda they're pursuing isn't political and doesn't depend upon making contentious political choices which require defending in the public square. There's an interesting parallel, I think, between the measures we're urged to take to mitigate the impact of climate change and the measures we were urged to take to mitigate the harm of COVID-19. And it's this, that, I think in both cases, the risks posed, both by the virus and by climate change, are quite low probability risks, but high consequence risks. And that means if you're going to introduce these incredibly disruptive, expensive measures to try and mitigate those low probability but high consequence risks, you're making a choice. You're prioritizing safety over liberty. And that's a contentious political choice that requires being defended. And I think for decades, advocates of net zero and related policies have, as you say, depended on presenting them as completely uncontroversial, technocratic policies that don't really require a political defense. And if anyone challenges them, there's this impulse to immediately demonize them as deniers or in the pay of the oil and gas industry and not engage in debate, not defend the policy agenda that they're pursuing. And I think for a while that was effective. Tactically, that was effective. I think a lot of people did feel inhibited. Maybe I'm wrong to say that it's human nature to want to kind of speak out, rebel, express yourself. For many people, just going along with groupthink seems to be a more natural response. Humans are naturally mimetic. They copy one another. So it was effective for a while. But actually, as the costs of mitigating the supposedly negative effects of climate change have increased quite dramatically in the past few years, particularly in the UK. So we now have the highest energy prices in the whole of Europe. And we've seen lots of small businesses in particular collapse because they can no longer afford their energy bills. Pubs are closing at the rate of, 24 a week. So the public have begun to turn. And there was an article recently about the collapse in the consensus that actually, no price was too high to pay to mitigate the impact of climate change. We had a responsibility to the planet and to future generations to pay a heavy price. But as people have begun to be asked to pay that price, so that consensus has begun to collapse.
Less keen on it.
And I think, if the advocates of these policies had been more prepared to defend them, had set out the arguments more clearly, had responded to critics in a more honest, good faith way, then maybe that public consensus wouldn't be so fragile. I think one of the hazards of avoiding debate, avoiding public argument, is that it's all very well when things are going well for your cause, and everyone thinks you're on the right side of history. But when things begin to turn, when things aren't going so well, you can no longer rely on just shaming people into silence. You need to have made the argument if you're going to bring people with you.
Yeah, and I think governments across the world have not levelled with the public about the costs, and whether you agree that the cost is worth the protection that, say, net zero will give to the planet or not is, a question for the individual, but there's been a lack of transparency. Toby, you have been a great, creator of things throughout your career. You've created schools and you've created, of course, more recently, the Free Speech Union. You founded that after an experience of yourself being cancelled. Can you talk about what that was like? Because, this is sort of, something we read about in the newspaper, so-and-so has been cancelled. We've just been witnessing, of course, Jimmy Kimmel, the American comedian. He's been cancelled because he said that the alleged assassin of Charlie Kirk was a MAGA supporter. And anyway, off it goes. It's a truly sort of horrific experience to be cancelled.
Yeah.
And yours was one of those cancellations, I think, that really spelled out what happens when the mob piles on and it's just sort of let rips, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was actually given that more and more people on the left are being targeted for cancellation, particularly in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder. I was thinking about writing a kind of guidebook for people on the left, how to cope with being cancelled. But in my case, I was appointed by the then British Prime Minister, Theresa May, to a new higher education regulator that had just been created for higher education in England called the Office for Students. I was one of 15 non-executive directors. It was a kind of nothing burger of a job. I was going to meet maybe the other directors 4 times a year. But in its wisdom, Downing Street decided to release this information that I'd been appointed at 1 minute after midnight on New Year's Day on 2018. And it looked as though they were trying to kind of bury this controversial news. Journalists, they thought...
Were they?
I don't think so. I think it was probably just cock-up rather than conspiracy.
Okay. Because it does really look as though... Who's reading press releases at 1 minute?
Yeah, everyone's, most journalists are drunk at that particular time. Anyway, so The Guardian kind of got it into its head that the government was trying to slip this out under the radar. And the editor decided that they weren't going to let the government get away with that. So front page, Guardian website, 1 minute after midnight, New Year's Day, it said something like Toby Young to be Theresa May's new universities czar, which was a kind of wild inflation of my role. And
if you were running the show.
As if I was running the whole show. I was going to be a czar.
And you'd been a controversial figure, according to the left at least, then because of your work on the free schools?
Yeah, I was a kind of hate figure on the left because I'd been a pioneer of the free schools policy and I helped set up 4 free schools and been a very public advocate for the free schools program.
And free schools meaning free of oversight of the state in terms of
in
curriculum.
America, they're called charter schools, so they're taxpayer funded, but they're much more independent than municipal taxpayer funded schools. So more freedom when it comes to paying conditions, curriculum, length of school day, that kind of thing. And many of the free schools were set up by groups of parents and teachers and charities. And that was an anathema to the kind of educational establishment and the teaching union.
And it's interesting, in Australia, our system is quite different from the UK, but you have this sort of concept of grammar schools as selective schools, which we have some selective state schools, but it's not such a, they're a very, very small proportion of schools and they tend not to be that controversial, whereas in Britain they were controversial, weren't they? There's sort of this sense that grammar schools are sort of...
Well, grammar schools have been very controversial for a long time,
they're sort of feeding elitism that these high-performing students get a special education and then, shoot off to
and I think,
hopefully Oxbridge.
Yes, and I think even though free schools can't select on the basis of intellectual ability, I think one of the reasons there was so much suspicion about the policy was because of kind of latent hostility to grammar schools.
Yeah, which your father had been opposed to.
My father wrote a book in the late 1950s called The Rise of the Meritocracy, in which he coined the word meritocracy and interestingly coined it to describe something he disliked rather than something he liked. And he was a lifelong socialist, a big supporter of Gough Whitlam. He was half Australian and from Melbourne actually originally. And as a socialist, he didn't like meritocracy because he felt it gave a kind of patina of fairness to the inequalities that were the inevitable product of capitalism.
Yes.
And insofar as it created this appearance of fairness, it would prolong the inevitable collapse of capitalism and the ushering in of the socialist Shangri-La. So that was his sort of principal reason for hating meritocracy. Yeah, but to go back to why I got cancelled.
We went off on a side road.
So when The Guardian put this on the front page of the website, that was like a kind of bat signal to the offence archaeologists who immediately set to work sifting through everything I'd said or written, in one case dating back to 1987, trying to find, material to be performatively outraged about. And because I'd been a controversial journalist most of my career, it took them all of 5 minutes to find a Tutankhamun's tomb's worth of kind of offensive content, and immediately started posting this on social media. By 12:05 on New Year's Day, I was trending on Twitter, which, I wouldn't wish that fate on anyone. That's bad. No one was to trend on Twitter.
No.
And it was people digging up stuff I'd said in The Spectator and on Twitter late at night, that kind of thing. And
of course, on Twitter, one sentence quote out of context, when you've written, say, a satirical piece for the Spectator, I mean, you're doomed, really, aren't you? You're doomed.
Yeah. And so there's kind of this deluge of kind of inappropriate material to show that I really wasn't a suitable person to be a university czar.
One of your quotes was that you were a porn addict, wasn't it?
Yeah, so someone found... Fraser Nelson, who was then the editor of The Spectator, he wrote an article saying that in The Spectator's digital archive, which contained every copy of The Spectator published, I think, since 1822, the 10 most searched for articles were all by me. And it was the offence archaeologists looking at everything I'd written for The Spectator. I've been a columnist for The Spectator since, early 2000s, looking for things to be offended by. And someone found an article I'd written in, I think, 2000, 2001, in which I had argued for a more liberal censorship regime, and at one point described Philip Larkin, former celebrated British poet, as a fellow porn addict. It was a sort of throwaway line, bit of
always the most dangerous lines.
Yes. And the sub-editor put the headline on the piece, Confessions of a Porn Addict. And some an offence archaeologist found this, couldn't believe their luck, screenshot it and reproduced it on Twitter. And then within an hour, the Evening Standard ran a piece, that's like the biggest evening newspaper in the country, saying Theresa May's university czar confesses to being porn addict. And then the Times reproduced it the next day. And there was just a ton of stuff like that on a kind of hourly basis. Someone started a petition on change.org urging Theresa May to sack me, and it got 350,000 signatures, had a press pack on kind of resignation watch on my doorstep. My wife and kids had to kind of run this gauntlet every time they should take them to school. It was just... it's sort of in retrospect kind of it quite funny. And even at the time, I remember thinking this would make a great kind of comic drama.
Yeah.
And started taking notes.
And you have written comic dramas before, haven't you?
Some comic dramas before, for television.
Yeah.
But anyway, after a week of being monstered, being piled on, I decided to apologise, which turned out to be a mistake, and to step down from my role on the Office for Students, thinking that would just draw a line under the whole affair and I could go back to my life. But actually that was like, tossing a hunk of raw meat to a shoal of piranha fish. Suddenly there was like blood in the water, feeding frenzy time. And they came after me in 4 other positions, and I had to, in the end, step down from 5 different positions.
So did you have any jobs left by the end of this?
Well, I still have my column in The Spectator.
All right.
But Fraser did not. Fraser stood by me. He was. But
that's why he made such a good choice as our Menzies orator in 2023.
Yes, well, he was very loyal.
Yeah.
Very honourable. But my income was, cut in half. I remember losing weight unexpectedly. I lost about half a stone in the kind of 8-day period in which I was, at the eye of this storm. And I actually wrote a piece called The Public Humiliation Diet.
Yes.
About it was sort of curious. I think it's partly when you find yourself targeted and excommunicated, you have this kind of visceral, semi-conscious fear that the mob that's coming for you on social media might suddenly materialize, on the street and start chasing you, wanting to literally rip you limb from limb. So you begin to shed weight, I think, so you can run faster in the opposite direction. It's a kind of primitive
survival technique. Yeah.
But when this was happening to me, I remember thinking my career that I'd built up over the past, 30 plus years was on fire. And I didn't know what to do to put it out.
Did you have friends who were, say, crisis comms experts? Or, was there anyone to talk to?
Not really. I had some friends in politics and their advisors, and I talked to them and they all gave me different advice.
Yeah.
And one bit of advice I received was, don't get out there on the airwaves and defend yourself. Less said, soonest mended.
The sort of Prince Andrew kind of tactic.
Well, but I think Prince Andrew, it
so
didn't
don't
work
do that.
out well, but don't do that. And
that hadn't happened, of course.
That hadn't happened at that point.
Yeah.
But that was the conventional wisdom, lie doggo. It'll all blow over. It'll get knocked off the news agenda soon enough by another story. Although, because it was the beginning of the year, it was a very slow news week, which didn't help. And I couldn't work. So I did that. And I think that was probably a mistake in retrospect. And I also didn't know whether apologizing would make it better or worse. And in the end, apologized and stood down. And that was probably a mistake too. And I didn't have much choice about whether to stand down because I was running an educational charity at that time, which was dependent on government funding. And I didn't want to antagonize people in the Department for Education by kind of clinging on for too long and embarrassing them and bringing this new regulator into disrepute. Other non-executive directors were threatening to resign unless I did. So it all became kind of untenable. But I remember thinking at the time, wouldn't it be useful if there was an organization that existed to give people good professional advice about what to do when they find themselves in this situation? And it was sort of in the infancy of the cancel culture era. This was now 7 years ago. And it didn't look as though, cancel culture was going away. It was clearly only going to get worse. So when I'd recovered, I then started the organization that I desperately wanted to be there when I was going through this. And that was the wellspring of the Free Speech Union.
And is the idea that you can advise people who, say, are being cancelled or having their free speech rights challenged on what not to do as you discovered through your experience? Is it sort of a handbook? Fight it. Yeah. Don't resign. Defend your corner.
It is quite difficult to come up with anything like a handbook. Often the best response varies from case to case.
Yeah.
And where we've been successful has not been in helping rehabilitate people who have been cancelled. We've tried to do that a bit, but much more effective is to help them fight when they're in the process of being cancelled, particularly if they're being put through a disciplinary procedure of some kind by a university or by their employer. We found that fighting back legally is the most effective way of fighting back. And we now have, I think, 5 lawyers in our legal team, and we work with about 50 lawyers on our legal advisory council. And the really big victories we've had have all been legal victories. And so I think one thing that's been a pleasant surprise is that particularly people targeted for cancellation, put through disciplinary processes at universities, is that if you fight back robustly and make it clear to the heads of department, the vice-chancellors, the pro-vice-chancellors, that there'll be a price to pay if they give in to the mob and just get rid of an awkward customer. If you make it clear that, neither option is going to be cost-free, it's surprising how often they'll back down. We've taken on, since starting the Free Speech Union I launched it in February 2020, we fought over 4,500 cases. And where they've come to a conclusion, we've been successful about 80% of the time.
Oh, that's a remarkable success rate. Yeah. And you've lobbied the government too for changes to legislation.
Yep.
So, you famously, I remember, had your PayPal account cancelled, didn't you?
Yes.
And there was a sort of a spate of debanking cases with. Nigel Farage is a famous one as well.
Yep.
And you managed to get that.
Yeah, I had PayPal cancelled 3 of my accounts. So my personal account, the Free Speech Union PayPal account, and I also run this news publishing site called the Daily Sceptic, and they cancelled that account too. So I kicked up a big fuss about it, and questions were raised in Parliament, and the head of PayPal was hauled before the financial regulator, and within a couple of weeks they'd restored all 3 of my accounts. But then I decided to try and do what I could to try and make it more difficult for other people to be debanked. And we did manage to persuade the Treasury to revise the payment services regulations to make it slightly more difficult for banks and payment services providers to debank people for political reasons. And because Rishi Sunak called a snap election unexpectedly, the regulations in the form of a statutory instrument weren't approved by Parliament. They were kind of knocked off the agenda because they were due to be approved on, I think, July 31st of 24, and he called the election for July 4th. So now we're going to have to wait until July 31st next year. But I think they are still on track to be approved in the form of a statutory instrument. So yeah, minor victory there. A bigger victory was the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. So for the last 5 years, the Free Speech Union and others have been lobbying for stronger protections for academic freedom and free speech on campus. And we have the same problem that you have in Australia and America of cancel culture on campus. And we did manage to get this pretty good piece of legislation through Parliament. It was a real battle, but we were involved at every stage, from drafting the white paper to making sure we won the debates in the House of Lords, and it got through the House of Lords. But as with the statutory instrument amending the payment services regulations, all the most important clauses in the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act were due to be implemented on August 1st, 2024. So because Rishi Sunak called the snap election, they weren't.
This election was a real problem.
It wasn't a great decision. And Labour, of course, won that election. And one of the first things Bridget Phillipson, the new Education Secretary, did when she got her feet under the desk was to pause the implementation of that particular Act of Parliament. So then we had to go to war with her, and we threatened the government with a judicial review if they didn't implement the outstanding clauses, all the most important clauses of that particular act. And a week before that case was due to be heard in the High Court, Bridget Phillipson did a partial U-turn and said she would implement the majority of the unimplemented clauses, although she repealed a couple and kept another couple under review. So that was a reasonably satisfying victory.
Yeah. You're here in Australia, and you, I guess, are partly Australian through your father. Can we claim
Australian.
that?
Australian, yeah.
We'll claim that. That's enough. We've had significant challenges. It's free speech here, and of course the federal government tried last year to pass legislation to combat misinformation as it conceives of it, and establish some sort of regulator of information, which, if anyone has read a George Orwell novel or two, will know that this is a very downward and scary spiral to no free speech at all. How do you rate our record on free speech here in Australia?
Well, I was worried when the federal government brought forward that bill, and relieved when it became clear it wouldn't get through the Senate. And I know that the Free Speech Union has spawned various sister organisations across the English-speaking world, including Australia. So there is a Free Speech Union of Australia, and it was very much involved in campaigning against that bill. And there was a similar proposal in the UK a couple of years ago. So the Online Safety Bill, as it then was, included a clause which would empower the Secretary of State, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, to draw up a list of priority content that Ofcom, our broadcast and now internet regulator, would be able to force social media companies to remove on pain of swingeing fines up to 10% of their annual global turnover. And the Secretary of State was going to be given the power to draw up a list of legal but harmful content that social media companies would then be under an obligation to remove on pain of being fined. And that, to me, was the crossing of a Rubicon, one of the great principles of English common law. And what differentiates it from continental law is that unless something is explicitly prohibited, it's permitted. That's a great kind of cornerstone of English liberty. On the continent, unless something is explicitly permitted, it's prohibited. Very different. And this seemed to be introducing a grey area in which something wouldn't be unlawful, but would nevertheless be prohibited. Legal, but harmful. Lawful, but awful. And so we very vigorously campaigned against that particular clause in the online safety bill, and it was stripped out. But now that it is an act of Parliament, there's now quite a lot of pressure, political pressure, to bring it back in. And one of the things the Online Safety Act did bring in was a new law which criminalised disinformation. So knowingly disseminating false information that causes others significant psychological harm is now a criminal offence, punishable by, I think, up to a year in jail. So,
but how do you know what's going to cause someone significant psychological harm? They might have an eggshell, skull in terms of their mental health. I mean, this seems extraordinarily
I think there is
draconian.
There is a reasonableness defence.
Okay.
So I think if what you've said is reasonable, even if you know it to be false. I mean, if it's, for instance, if it was intended ironically or as a joke, or it's a parody account, I don't think it's been terribly successful, but that is one of the defences available to you. So I guess you could protect yourself from, being prosecuted because someone is particularly psychologically fragile, although I think there have been, a surprising number of prosecutions under Section 179 of the Online Safety Act.
What's the public's view of these types of pieces of legislation? I mean, do they think that major problems in society are going to be solved this way, or?
I think, I think the public is beginning to wake up to the dangers of overzealous policing of social media. So The Times ran a story a few months ago based on freedom of information requests, this information it had obtained, which showed that over 12,000 people in the UK were being arrested under suspicion of committing just 2 speech offences. And it was almost all for things they'd said online. And that works out at over 30 people a day being arrested and then investigated because people have complained about stuff they've said on social media that they think is offensive. And very few of those investigations result in prosecution, about 5%. But nevertheless, it obviously has a very chilling effect on free speech. And the Free Speech Union tries to highlight as often as it can when the police have overreacted to a complaint about something somebody has said. A great recent example was Graham Linehan, the celebrated comedy writer who co-created Father Ted, a celebrated sitcom. He returned to Heathrow from America and he was arrested by 5 armed police officers because of 3 tweets he'd posted mocking trans rights activists. And luckily he's a member of the Free Speech Union and we were able to defend him. And one of the bail conditions that was imposed on him was that he couldn't post anything on X, whilst he was under investigation, but we managed to get that lifted. And I think the police will probably decide to take no further action, at which point we will help him sue the police for wrongful arrest and false imprisonment. I mean, he was held in a cell at Heathrow for over 12 hours and only released when his blood pressure became so high, the medic became concerned that he was about to have a stroke and he was rushed to accident and emergency. There was another case even more recently, which coincided with Trump's visit to the United Kingdom, state visit. An American citizen living in the UK was visited by a police officer because of a post she'd made on Facebook, and he didn't tell her what it was. And he said it probably wasn't unlawful, but he wanted her to apologise.
It was harmful, was it?
It was harmful. Yeah, it was lawful but awful. And luckily, she was very robust, pushed back, said, I'm a member of the Free Speech Union. Why aren't you out there investigating burglaries and rapes and murders? Why are you bothering with this?
Is there a pushback to that? I mean, you're saying, was it 3 people a day are being arrested under these?
30 people a day.
Sorry, 30 people
I think
a day.
30 people a day, yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of police time that's
being
diverted from crimes that are actually putting people's lives in danger.
Yeah, and I think that argument is really landing. Even if people don't care as much as they should about free speech, people are very aware that if their house is burgled or their car broken into, the police are unlikely even to turn
Sorry,
up.
I couldn't make it. I know it's a home invasion, but Gary down the street, you should have seen what he put on Twitter. We've got to sort this out now.
Yeah. We've got this banner that we roll out whenever one of these cases hits the news, and we stand outside a court or a police station which says, police our streets, not our tweets. And I think that lands with the public. The public know that, you know, there are all these crimes going unsolved, and the police really shouldn't be wasting their time investigating hurty words on social media. Another related phenomenon, which I think is also increasingly angering the public, is the amount of time the police spend investigating and recording non-crime hate incidents, which sounds like something George Orwell would have come up with. But actually, it's a real thing. In 2014, the College of Policing, which is a kind of training education body, a Quango, which oversees the police in England and Wales, came up with this concept of a non-crime hate incident. So if someone reports a hate crime, often something they've objected to on social media, or someone just looking at them funny. One person was reported for whistling the tune to Bob the Builder, a cartoon which they thought was a reference to their Welsh ethnicity because the central character is Welsh. I mean, all crazy stuff. If the police, on investigating a report like that of a possible crime, conclude that no crime has been committed, but nevertheless the victim's perception is that the perpetrator is motivated by hostility towards one of their protected characteristics, their race or their religion, it's recorded as a non-crime hate incident. And since 2014, the police have recorded over 250,000 NCHIs, which is just, it's the average of about 60 plus a day. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
So, I mean, this type of policing is then going down into the level of our personal interaction. So you can't, I mean, you know, people can be really unpleasant to each other. That just is part of the sort of human condition, isn't it?
Yeah.
But this is putting it into a policing context now where you can't just have a disagreement or be rude to someone and walk off. It now is... it now will result in a police response. And, you know, I guess that begs the question, what's happened to the democratic culture where you can't leave human beings to sort out these things themselves or not? I mean, just say, well, that person's a bit of a douche and, you know, we're going to move on and get over it, as we used to say in Australia. But no, now we need to send in the authorities. We can't actually regulate human interaction anymore. We need the government, basically, the state, to step in and sort everything out, everything.
Yes. I mean, I think that is part of the problem. I think it's also that activists have figured out how to enlist the police in service of their particular political agenda. So if they claim, you know, if a trans rights activist claims that someone who's misgendered them is motivated by hatred for their trans identity, then the police will identify it as a potential hate crime and be much more likely to investigate it. It doesn't always work that way. So if you're a Jew and you complain about, you know, a pro-Palestinian protester standing in front of you and screaming from the river to the sea, the police are just likely to say, sorry, free speech, free society, take it on the chin. But the reverse, they will be much more likely to investigate. And it's partly, I think, to do with the kind of capture of the police by the radical progressive left. They all get this training now in which they're exposed to a diagram called the Pyramid of Hate. And the hypothesis is that the persecution of minorities begins with hurty words. It begins with jokes, the othering of out groups by the majority.
And what the end result is, they vote for Nigel Farage.
That's top of the pyramid is genocide. Just below that is Voting Reform UK.
Yeah. But I mean, in the end, I don't think you can blame the police. They are taking orders from basically the elected politicians who are the ministers. And, you know, the buck has to stop with the government. And the government's got this wrong. Yeah. Toby Young, I know we could speak for many more hours on this, but this has been a fantastic conversation. I think quite alarming. I wish we had ended on some sort of...
Well, a positive note.
Yes, please, let's...
I think non-crime hate incidents may not be much longer for this world. Well, so the head of the Metropolitan Police, 2 other senior police officers, recently wrote to the Home Secretary in the wake of Graham Linehan's arrest, recommending that some of the guidance around non-crime hate incidents be changed. There's a crime and policing bill that's going to be before the House of Lords in a few weeks' time, and I'm going to propose an amendment to that bill, scrapping non-crime hate incidents. And I think I've persuaded a former Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, who's now in the House of Lords, to co-sponsor that amendment.
Fantastic.
So I think there is now a head of steam is beginning to gather around an effort to scrap NCHI. So I hope maybe this time next year they'll be gone.
They'll be gone, and hopefully there are rays of hope here in Australia too, that the Combating Misinformation Bill
won't be brought back.
But here in Victoria, unfortunately, we ain't so lucky. But Toby Young, it's wonderful to have you here in Australia. You're delivering the Menzies Oration on the 24th of September, which will be around free speech and the courage to disagree. And I think a culture of being able to disagree and that it's okay has to be supported to rebuild that, because I think we've really lost the habit, the ability to do that. And ultimately, this free speech is fundamental to our democracy. And if we care about living in a democracy, you have to care about free speech.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.